Okay, welcome everyone. So let's start the webinar for today. So my name is Dr. Hamad and I'm the co-chair of the IEEE MTTAP EMC and CAST joint chapter in Islamabad. And this talk is a part of our webinar series. Actually, it's the 27th talk today, which we are bringing to you. And I'll start with a brief intro about the chapter and where it is located, about the institute, and then I'll hand over the floor to our worthy speaker. So we are based in Islamabad, which is the capital of Pakistan, and it's one of the best managed city of the country and very picturesque with Margala Hills, surrounded by Margala Hills. And this is a city where National University of Sciences and Technology is located. And we plan to hold the first IEEE International Conference on Microwave Antennas and Circuits, IC-MAC, in 2021 in Islamabad. And we hope to see the worthy speaker of today, as well as all of you, to join this conference later in the year. So the National University of Sciences and Technology is located in Islamabad, and it is actually it has campuses over all the 4 provinces of Pakistan, but the main campus is in Islamabad, and we are located here in the highlighted part of this picture, the Research Institute for Microwave and Millimeter Wave Studies, abbreviated as RIMMS. So RIMMS focus is a postgraduate institute, and it focuses on master's and PhD in electrical engineering, and it houses state-of-the-art facilities related to microwave research, both passive and active circuits, as well as the antenna research. So we have an anechoic chamber going up to 40 gigahertz, as well as the electromagnetic compatibility and electromagnetic interference lab, which supports the research work going on by the graduate students. So today's webinar series brings Dr. Francesco Fioranelli from the Department of Microelectronics, TU Delft in the Netherlands. And the title of his talk is Radar Old But Gold, Current Research Challenges and Activities in Radar Micro-Doppler Signatures. So before handing over to him, I'd like to share his brief biography. So Dr. Francesco received his bachelor's in engineering with cum laude and master's in engineering also with cum laude in telecommunication engineering from the University of Polytechnique di Marche, Ancona, Italy in 2007 and 2010 respectively, and the PhD degree from Durham University in UK in 2014 with a thesis on through-wall radar imaging. He is currently an assistant professor at TU Delft in the Microwave Sensing Signals and Systems group, and was also an assistant professor at the University of Glasgow from 2016 to 2019. And he also spent some time as a research associate at University College London with Professor Hugh Griffiths. Professor Francesco's research interests include the development of radar systems and automatic classification for human signatures analysis in healthcare and security drones and UAV detections and classification, automotive radar, wind farm and sea clutter, and he has authored more than 90 publications between book chapters, journals and conference papers, and also edited a book on micro-Doppler radar and its applications. So Professor Francesco is a senior member of the IEEE and a chartered engineer with the IET. So with that, I would give the floor to Professor Francesco. I'd request him to share his slides.
Right. Can you see my slides?
Yes, I can. I'm just making them live. And I'll also make your camera live, and your slides are going live now. So okay. Francesco, you can go ahead. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much for your introduction, and first of all for the invitation of being here. It's nice to hear that I'm the 27th speaker, and it's very good to see your successful series of webinars. Right, so for everyone online, thank you for joining. As you heard, the title of the talk today is about radar, old but gold, and specifically I want to share with you some of the recent, let's say, research topics and trends that we have explored using specifically micro-Doppler signatures. You heard already about myself. There's not much more to say. I'm from Italy originally. I studied in the UK and worked there for some time, and I joined TU Delft here in the Netherlands in November 2019, where I am an assistant professor at the moment. This is our group, MS3, Microwave Sensing, Signals and Systems, which is essentially the radar and antenna group at TU Delft. You can see here the faces of the people that we have, and if you want to see a bit more about what we do, etc., you can go on our website radar.tudelft.nl. Right. Probably most of you in the audience are familiar with what is radar, the acronym of the name, and also how it works. But I always like to cite a couple of things about the history of radar, also taken from my lectures when I discuss with my students. Maybe some of you know already who is, let's say, the inventor of radar, or who we think is the person that invented or experimented with radar for the first time is this German engineer, Christian Hülsmeyer, at the beginning of the 20th century. What I a bit like about the history of Christian Hülsmeyer is that he was very young. He was 22 years old. So let's say the age of our university students when he came up with this invention. And also his first attempt to patent radar was rejected in 1903. So that reminds me of maybe the times that we get paper rejected or research proposal rejected, or things that don't go immediately right the first time. And this happened also to the inventor of radar. But what about radar today? So we can think that we can argue, I would say, that radar addresses the need of detecting and recognizing objects at a very long distance and in all weather conditions. So irrespective of the fact that there might be clouds or fog or smoke or very particular conditions of light. And this is something that we still need very much today in sectors like the aviation sector, the navigation, autonomous systems, etc. So when people tell us, maybe as a microwave radar engineer, that there's nothing new in radar. Radar is an old technology, nothing new to do or to explore. I think this is not a correct statement. In fact, I would argue that radar research today has got possibility of being connected to some areas of research that maybe might sound more trendy or more up to date. And I'm talking, for example, about the artificial intelligence and machine learning, deep learning that can allow our radars to become, let's say, more intelligent. I'm thinking about the progress in electronics and let's say circuits design. So technology that allows the radars to become smaller, more powerful, consume less power, more autonomous, etc. And finally, also the research works that tries to move radar up in the frequency spectrum. So covering the sub-terahertz or terahertz region where there are applications, but not so many in terms of radars, and interesting properties in terms of the reflectivity, the scattering of targets of interest are appearing in that range. So I would argue that there is still research to do in radar. Now, today, most of what I'm talking about is related to micro-Doppler. So first, we want to say a couple of things about Doppler. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the concept, but while I was researching this topic, I found that one of the classic examples that we do when we explain Doppler to students, the fact that even in acoustic waves, Doppler is manifested as a change in the pitch of the sound that we hear. Actually, in the 19th century, a Dutch chemist, this professor from Utrecht University, made this experiment where he put a trumpet player on the train, and he had people listening while the train was passing by. And here you can recognize the classic formula of Doppler shift. So it's quite interesting to find out that Utrecht is just maybe half an hour by train, 40 minutes from here, is one of the first places where this effect was also, let's say, explored. But when we go into from Doppler to micro-Doppler, what exactly do we mean? So micro-Doppler is a term, let's say, that was used the last around the 90s. So, and it was invented, let's say, or started to be used by Victor Chen, who is generally regarded as one of the first researchers that started research in radar micro-Doppler. And what is it? It's basically the pattern of frequency modulations that are added on top of the backscatter signal and created by the moving components of a radar target. This is exactly the, let's say, the definition that Victor Chen gave. So we hear immediately that basically the micro-Doppler signature is related to components that move in an object. So if we think of a helicopter, it could be, for example, the rotor blades that are rotating. If we're looking at a person or an animal, we're looking at the motion of limbs, legs, arms, etc. The micro-Doppler shift, the micro-Doppler signature or micro-Doppler shift is additional. So it's something that, let's say, is on top of the normal bulk total Doppler shift that a moving target will show. And an interesting thing is to note that micro doesn't mean that these modulations are small. The object that produces micro-Doppler effect can be very big. Think, for example, of the blades of a helicopter, quite a large object. And also the amount of the Doppler shift, of the micro-Doppler shift, can be quite high. So it can be in the order of tens of kilohertz, etc. So it can be a signal whose frequency is quite high. So we need to design our system in the correct way to capture such signature. Therefore, we shouldn't be, let's say, deceived by the word micro in this case. What was the drive, let's say, behind exploring this phenomenon? It was mostly a classification drive, so a situational awareness to try and understand what type of objects, what type of targets were around the radar. And this is due to the fact that because each object will move in a specific way in terms of its kinematics and of its velocity pattern, also the micro-Doppler signature would be very much unique to the type of object or to the specific, maybe individual class of object that we are interested in detecting and then classifying. So if we think, for example, in automotive scenarios, we can say that different people, pedestrians, cyclists, and maybe vehicles will have different degrees of micro-Doppler. Another typical problem is the classification of drones or UAVs, and they all have a different number of blades, different type of rotation, and that can distinguish them between themselves and from birds, for example. We could discuss for a very long time on how to study, how to characterize the micro-Doppler signature of objects, and I'll just give a couple of hints and maybe a couple of references in this presentation. So generally, what we do, we try to model a real target as a superposition of different point scatterers. Each point is described by a radar cross-section value, and then we have some equations that describe how the velocity of these points is over time. Then we use time frequency distributions, so let's say signal processing techniques like short time Fourier transform or others to construct what we call a micro-Doppler spectrogram. So essentially a pattern of Doppler shift and therefore velocity as a function of time. If we go back to Victor Chen work, which as I mentioned is one of the first, let's say, to try and model explicitly this effect, the micro-Doppler effect in radar, we can see that it's all down to the representation of a rigid object as a point scatter, some equations that describe its translational motion or rotational motion in terms of their kinematics, and then calculating the radar return that the radar will see. here you see a classic equation of the translational movement of the Doppler, and this is due to the rotation. So we have angular velocity here in the formula. These equations are all, let's say, derived under some key assumptions, but these are assumptions that make sense, let's say, in radar domain. So, for example, assuming that the velocity is very low compared to c, this is typical of any man-made targets, let's say, or that the objects tend to be in the electromagnetic far field. Again, not so unreasonable as assumption, because generally, well, we want to use radar to check to see things that are far away. So if you are interested, you can go in Victor Chen book or papers and see how these equations are derived. But you will find essentially that both the vibrational microDoppler or the rotational microDoppler heavily depend on essentially how the movement of the target is. And you can see it here in the geometric description, but also on FC, so the carrier frequency of the radar. Nothing too new, because also the normal Doppler, let's say that the bulk Doppler depends on the carrier frequency of the radar. When we look at more complicated targets than objects just made by one point, as I was mentioning earlier, that's the typical approach that tries to, let's say, decompose or represent a complex target, a complex body like a human body, for example, or an animal, as the superposition of different point scatterers. And of course, here the challenge is, how many point scatterers do you need to represent the realistic scattering of an object at a certain frequency, and also how to describe correctly their kinematics, so their position and their velocity over time, so that you can then reconstruct back the expected radar signature. In the earlier papers, for example, the Bullock-Tallman model is one that is generally mentioned as a way to describe the motion of a human walking, for example. I mentioned earlier the short-time Fourier transform is one of the tools. Yes, it's basically one of the most used signal processing tool, I would say, for the characterization of the microDoppler signature. It's something that is used in other fields as well. For example, speech or audio analysis, there are also calculation of short-time Fourier transform, because essentially you want to do the same thing. You want to calculate how different the different Doppler components, so different, which are related to the different velocities or different moving parts of your target, are evolving over time. If we calculate that, it's just equivalent to taking a Fourier transform on a window of the signal that we want to analyze and slide this window, calculating multiple Fourier transforms. Again, I think this couple of nice figures from Victor Chen and Hao Ling book are quite, let's say, self-explanatory on how short-time Fourier transform works. Generally, people will talk about spectrogram. I will show you lots of spectrograms in the following slides, and this is simply the magnitude of the short-time Fourier transform, or some people describe it as the power, so the square magnitude of that. Now, where am I? Let's say in my research, I mostly, or I together with my students and my collaborators use microDoppler signature to do classification of targets. So that's where our research is. And typical objects, let's say, or targets that we use that are human signatures of drones, UAV, and a little bit in the automotive domain. Although the usage of microDoppler in the automotive is not that relevant, because you don't have the time often to construct a meaningful microDoppler signature. You have to decide much more quickly what is the target in front of you. And this is a bit of, in a nutshell, I would say, the pipeline of most of the research in this area. So you always start from some data, either coming from a model like that Stickman that I showed you a couple of slides earlier, or from experimental data. You do some form of processing. This could be classic radar signal processing, I don't know, CFAR to detect targets, Doppler processing, cleaning, removal of static clutter. You can name a few. But at some point, you want to extract some features. So you want to take the most important pieces of information to address the problem of classification that you are trying to address at that moment. And finally, you have some form of machine learning, so some form of classifier can go from very simple one to more complex mathematically type of tools. But the idea is always that you train an algorithm that based on some data that automatically can then make a decision on what type of targets the radar is seeing. Recently, of course, like many other fields, deep learning and let's say the application of neural networks have also taken lots of interest in this field. And the interest in the neural network is that you can do these processes here, let's say automatically, or in a way where the input from the human researcher is not so needed as before. This can go even up to some parts of the conventional radar signal processing that some people argue it's better if they are performed inside the network. So you give the network, let's say, data that are more untreated, more kind of raw data. But this is there is discussion, let's say, in the community of at which point you want the network to come into play. And what can you use this micro-Doppler for? This is just, let's say, a very generic application map, and I will show you a couple of examples, a few examples in the following slides. So it can be, as was mentioning, healthcare, mostly human activities. Let's say ground-based surveillance, more in terms of security or removal of wind turbines clusters, and then drones and autonomous systems. Now, if we start looking at the human body as one of the targets, human body has a very distinct and very interesting micro-Doppler signatures because we have, let's say, lots of degrees of freedom on what in our body we can move and how. These slides just show you the difference between how a simulated micro-Doppler, which is given by the superposition of the return from the movement of each individual scatter point looks like, compared to an experimental signature. In this case, the experimental signature was taken outdoor for a person working in a field, and we were looking at an S-band radar. But typically, the micro-Doppler signature of a person working, it's always more or less like this. There is, let's say, a central contribution which is stronger because it's related to the torso and the body of the person, so the largest part in all people. And then there are these, let's say, these streaks, these lines that are caused by the movement of the limbs, so arms and legs, which are, let's say, moving faster than the torso. So you can see that the Doppler is, let's say, higher and lower, and but also less intense in terms of signature. Why? Because the limbs, a leg or an arm, are generally smaller in terms of volume, and therefore in terms of radar cross section compared to the torso signature. What can you do with such information? You can do several things. For example, this is a relatively old piece of work that we did at UCL, at University College London. We were trying to see if in an outdoor scenario you can check whether the person is, let's say, unloaded, so carrying nothing, or carrying various objects like a big rucksack or an object that, in terms of size, was similar to, let's say, a rifle. You can see the extent of the micro-Doppler. If you remember, I just told you that these streaks are due to the arms. How much is compressed and how much it changes if let's say, the person is less free to move their arms or their shoulders. And we tried here just a very silly example where first the person was, let's say, working with hands in pocket, and you see really is concentrated around just the torso that is moving, then just normal working, then picking up an object and holding the object with two hands, and you can see how the micro-Doppler spread increases and decreases accordingly. Another application is identifying people, because we all work in different ways. In terms of how we move our legs and how we oscillate our torso. Therefore, microDoppler can be also a way, let's say, to identify people. Here you see a couple of examples. These 3 microdopplers on the right-hand side are 3 people just walking outdoor at very, let's say, long distance, maybe 70 meters. Whereas here you see 6 people working indoor in a home care, actually, where we recorded some data in a care home in Glasgow, in Scotland. Essentially, all people were asked to do the same movement, just walk back and forth in front of the radar in a common room. But you can see how different the average velocity and this pattern around the center of the microDoppler is, depending on the people, depending on if they're using, for example, some walking aids like a walking stick, or in general how mobile their legs and their motions are. So, besides, let's say, identifying specific individuals, there's also a wealth of information about the mobility level and how the different steps and stride of the person that we can extract from these microDoppler signatures. And this is one of the, let's say, part of the activities that we put under, let's say, the domain of healthcare applications of radars. So mostly 3 things. I have already mentioned the idea of analyzing the gait of how the person walks and to see if there is any imbalance. You can then analyze patterns of activities. This traditionally was born as an approach to do fall detection. So to be able to see if an elderly person, for example, living at home, would fall down and it was incapable to come back up on his own or on her own. So the ambulance or a carer or someone would go for help, but it actually can be much more than that. So we can analyze movement patterns for that person to see if there's any anomaly developing, and then we could go also in much smaller movements, so vital signs, and looking at the Doppler or the displacement induced by very small movement of the thorax and chest when we want to measure respiration and heartbeat. Now, why radar? Why not using other technologies? Let's say one potential advantage of radar is that it's a non-intrusive technology, so it doesn't require contact with the person to be monitored, like, for example, a wearable system. And we could argue that it's more privacy oriented because you're not taking plain optical pictures or videos of the person or the internal environment of their homes. And here I'll just show you here and in the following slides a few pictures with the references just to see a little bit how they look like. So here you see 6 different gates where the red and white curves are basically just the envelope around the spectrogram, and these are 6 different activities. Of course, one complexity, let's say, in the research is that we don't move in segments, but we move continuously. So if we think of, I don't know, an everyday activity that we perform in our own home or office, we move continuously. So all the activities here you see just a very short example of 30 seconds happen one after the other. And there's no way to predict exactly when one activity will finish and the next one will start. So a classifier or a analysis algorithm will need to be able to understand where the transitions between these activities are. And this is, I would say, an open challenge. This is also true for vital signs. This was an example of a scenario that we measured in Glasgow with a student. So we had the person sitting on a chair and breathing normally, and then simulating sort of loss of breath. So no breath, holding breath, and you can really see the difference here, and then simulating a fast breathing rate as if the person was having some problems, and the difference between the 3 different breathing styles, let's say, are quite clear. In terms of deep learning that I was mentioning earlier to address this problem of analysis of a continuous sequence of activities. We've been recently using this recurrent neural networks, in particular this bi-directional long short-term memory. It's not the only choice. There's many different networks with various parameters that, for example, the speech processing, audio processing community have proposed. And one of the topics that we were looking at with Aman, one of my students in Glasgow, was indeed to try and see if any of those techniques could be applied rather than to a sequence of sounds to a sequence of human activities like the one that you see here. I'll show you here a nice result. I would say this is the nicest results, of course, I put in the presentation, but it's not always that easy to find a network capable to do that and to train it accordingly. This was another piece of work that we did in Glasgow, where we did not just use the radar, but we had the radar in the environment and also an accelerometer, gyroscope, a magnetometer on a wearable on the wrist of the person. And then we tried to do some different fusion algorithms. This is to say that, of course, I am a radar person, so I'm describing a lot about radar, but actually most likely in the smart home of the future, you're gonna have multiple types of sensors. So some sort of multimodality is really what you need to develop to create a nice picture of the well-being of the person in that environment. This is a piece of work done in Delft, so it's just a different way of doing the same thing. So analyzing, for example, activities and analyzing gestures. In this case, we did not want to use the spectrogram. So this is, let's say, is the usual pipeline of signal processing that majority of the work will look, but we just try to look at the phase information only without calculating the spectrograms. And although these patterns of phase for different activities might look very, very similar by human eye, we looked at histogram of orientated gradients, HOG, which are image processing features that have been proposed for other stuff to find lines and contours in images, but this worked very well in this image, in these phase plots of radar as well. And that was in a way also unexpected, because you look at them here and they really look just a mess. Not much more in this one. This is just a setup that was done in collaboration with the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, and Dr. Sevgi Gurbus there, where we're still looking at gates one after the other, but we're looking at the combination of different radars and different techniques to fuse and combine the information from these different radars, which is also what we are doing here in Delft. So this is a picture of our lab. We got 5 radars, and this is the area where the person performs different activities. And you can see how simultaneously, you can see how the spectrograms and the range time plots are sort of complementary to each other if you can exploit the multi-perspective view analyzing the movement of the person. And the final slide about this is that not only people, but also animals have a micro-Doppler. And this is a piece of work that we started almost by chance in Glasgow with some colleagues from the veterinary school to check lameness in farmed animals, in particular dairy cows, which are quite significant in the UK for the economy, and sheep. You see here, maybe the picture is small, but these white things here, it's lots of sheep that would pass inside here, and we would record their micro-Doppler. This work is very, very preliminary at the moment, and there's a PhD student that is looking into it. But the idea is similar to people. So although in this case the animals will have a quadrupedal gait, so 4 legs, of course, but if they are lame, and that lameness is a symptom of more serious disease, the radar can pick it up and maybe automatically allow to pre-screen some of the animals to point out the attention of the vets. So to conclude, let's say this chunk of slides on human and little bit animal activities, there's still, I would argue, some research, open research challenges. First of all, the activities and the movement of people is continuous and diverse, because at the same time, a person can do a gesture, but there's also respiration maybe that you want to record, and the person maybe is also working somewhere. So although each paper in the literature try to look only at one aspect, actually you have a much more complex and continuous sequence of movements that you have to be able to deal with. You have a problem of labeling the data. So unless you want to, let's say, force PhD students or yourself to do this manual labeling, if you are recording hours and hours of data, how do you manage an automatic labeling? Maybe thinking of ways of where camera data can be used in conjunction with the radar or schemes like that. How to incorporate some of the model or physics-based information into your classification algorithm. So although there's a push, let's say, to go for fully data-driven methods, actually we have some strong priors of information in terms of how human beings move. For example, if you want to stand up, it means that before you sat down at some point. You can't just stand up from a standing position. So how to incorporate all these priors in your classification algorithm? And then the open set problem. So activities, gestures that a human can perform are infinite. You cannot train for all of them. How would your algorithm, or should your algorithm, react if there is a new gesture or a gesture that is performed in a slightly different way? And in general, all of this acts in a data scarcity regime. We're not in the image processing community where you have maybe a large, huge data set that everyone that has been shared or created by the contributions of many researchers. At the moment, in the radar community, there's a little bit of scattering. Every group, every paper has his own data set, and things are analyzed or benchmarked only on that. And I believe we could go perhaps beyond that. To try and do a little bit of this, we have decided to make our data collected at the University of Glasgow public, and you can see the link here, and you can download this data in case you are interested. Quickly, before I run out of time, this is a completely different application, no longer human. We're looking at UAVs, so drones. And for example, in the UK, we saw how this can be a problem when Gatwick Airport during Christmas time was shut down for 2 days because there was one drone or maybe two drones. These are difficult targets to see with the radars because they are very small. So the radar cross-section is very low, and they're very mobile, very maneuverable. So tracking them, it's especially against the background of clutter or moving clutter, it's very, very difficult. In Glasgow, there's a student that I'm co-supervising that is looking at, let's say, developing a radar that is optimizable to track these platforms. But what I want to show you is a piece of work done by another student, a master student called Jacob Sim, who worked with Availlant, which is now part of Thales. Here you see 2 screens seen by the radar operator. The first one on the left is with a not so good algorithm, classification algorithm. The right one is with an algorithm that takes into account some of the micro-Doppler information to classify drones. In this recording, there was only one real drone, which is operating up here on the top right of the screen. But when the algorithm is not nice, there's so many other false alarms and other non-drones objects that the radar thinks to see here, when actually there was only one drone over here. And I have a quick video to show you this. This video was done in Belgium as part of a European project that Availlant was part of, and it's the harbor in Antwerp, one of the most important in Europe for traffic. And what you will see in the video, you will see that at some point here there is a drone that takes off, and the radar at some point switches on the, let's say, drone detection algorithm, and you will see that all the other, the drone is here, all the other non-drone targets that still are detected will be cancelled by the algorithm. So there you go. So you're left with just the track of the true real drone that was flying there, and all the other targets are removed. I can't say too much about the details of the algorithm, but this is an algorithm that was basically based on micro-Doppler signature of the drone. So taking into account that piece of information. Something similar was done by another student called Cameron, also working with Availlant. And in this case, basically, the very simple, or perhaps, the very simple feature that was used was just to count the pairs of the peaks that we would see in the micro-Doppler signature of a drone. So these vertical lines that you see here, which are due indeed to the modulation of the rotating blades of the drone. And with that alone, already with only that piece of information, you can see that you get a nice separation between objects that are no drones in red in this histogram, and objects that are drones, both rotary types of drones and fixed wing. Of course, this is good, but it works only if you have enough signal-to-noise ratio to see these blades in the micro-Doppler signatures. If you're not able to do that, you need to, let's say, think of other ways to differentiate a drone versus other targets. One good thing about these features is that they are extremely explainable. So you can easily look at the spectrogram, or in this case at this cut, and see with your own eye and count them how the feature work. And this is a good advantage compared to maybe more complex architectures of classification, like, I don't know, neural networks that might sometimes appear as a black box. So it's difficult to understand why certain classification decisions are made rather than others. Final slide to show one piece of work that is done at the University of Glasgow, and I'm still partially involved with it, which is the simulation of the signature of multiple UAVs, so like a swarm. In this case, the simulator is called Maverick, and it's been developed by the aerospace and aerodynamic engineer at the University of Glasgow. So the simulator is able to represent with good fidelity the movement of the drones and the blades. What we're trying to do, we're trying to build, let's say, a radar signature simulator on top of it. Still work in progress. You can see here, for example, an initial result where you have on the left-hand side experimental data of a drone, and on the right-hand side the time range and time plot and the spectrogram. Of course, this spectrogram is still very much simplistic compared to this one, but we're kind of working on it to increase its fidelity, let's say, and its performance, especially where there are multiple drones in sight. So that was the last slide of my presentation. Maybe lots of things, hopefully not too many, but I wanted more to give you, let's say, a broad overview of what radar micro-Doppler signatures can be used for, rather than going into too many details of each of them. But very happy to take any questions if you have questions. Thank you once again for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Felchensko, for the interesting work you have done over the last many years. So we have a few questions lined up for you. The first one is, what is the frequency band for the micro-Doppler radar?
Most of the figures that I showed you are the frequency is relatively low, so we're looking at either S-band or C-band radar, and the S-band precisely really working in the ISM band, so 2.4 and 5.8 gigahertz. So majority of what I showed you is really, let's say, low frequency.
Right. And the next related question is, the micro-Doppler radar single transmitter receiver or multiple receivers?
It depends. So if I go back on my slides, in this scenario, we were lucky to have multistatic radars. So there were 3 nodes. One node was acting as a monostatic radar, and then there were 2 bistatic receivers only radars. Whereas in the indoor scenarios that I showed, for example, here or these other slides, these are all single transmitter, single receiver radars. So it's only one of them, and if there are multiple of them, they're not cooperating with each other. So it's like distributed monostatic radars.
Mm-hmm. Right. And is the setup you showed used for is capable of beamforming?
No, because most of these commercial radars that we used at the time had only one receiver channel, so we could not do any beamforming.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
Here in Delft, we trying to do some work on automotive radar, so millimeter wave platforms, and those have some beamforming capability, but we haven't explored fully yet the micro-Doppler, let's say.
Right. So the next question was actually related to millimeter wave. On one of the slides, you showed the application of micro-Doppler for detecting vital signs. So can you share your views about its application for vital signs monitoring, and which frequency band would be suitable for that? Would it be microwave bands, the lower ones, or the millimeter wave ones?
I think you have different, let's say, aspects to balance. One is if you want to use the Doppler information, or let's say if you have enough range resolution, because maybe you go up in the spectrum and therefore you have a wider band, maybe you can just, let's say, capture the effect of the vital sign by looking at the displacement. So you're not practically looking at Doppler, but you're sort of tracking the position of the chest very, very, very precisely over time. That could be one thing that millimeter wave, or even this, let's say, research that tries to push the frequency higher, not just 77 gigahertz, but maybe 130 gigahertz or even higher, could give you. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, that with the higher frequencies and the smaller wavelength, you could have better capabilities to kind of capture really almost the texture of the surface of the body. I cannot think of any, well, definitely it's not something that we have done so far. We've been thinking of that. But I can't think of anything at the moment that we have done, or a paper that can tell you, yes, X has done that. But I think people are thinking on that, are looking into that to see whether this higher frequency can give you more on vitals.
Right. Actually, just to share with you that we are, experimenting with a 60 gigahertz radar to measure those displacements. And one challenge we are encountering is actually the body movements. So the normal body movement. So is there a way to filter, to gather those displacements, but also somehow filter the movements, which in your examples you wanted to detect, but in our case we want to filter. So any thoughts about?
Good question. I don't have a magic wand for that. I can see that as a problem, definitely, because even a smaller movement at that frequency might become very large and basically mask any small displacement that you want to see. I think maybe one possible way is, if these transceivers become more and more capable in terms of angular resolution and multiple channels, perhaps some form of beamforming could be implemented to sort of focus, you know, or if you want to, I don't know, track the vitals, you could look at the thorax, at the torso, and sort of forget a little bit more the limbs. That could be one way, but I'm not sure. I think it is definitely a challenge. So I would say that researchers that are able to come up with methods to do this sort of separation of the signals of the macro motion and the smaller vitals that you want to track, yeah, those are. It's an interesting research direction. So I don't know. If I was a PhD student or someone really listening, I would feel that that's where a nice contribution can come.
Okay, right. Thank you for you know the thoughts. So the next question is Maverick available for the general public?
I think the answer is complicated. So the answer is yes, but I think it's in a stage where the code is not tidy up enough that people can share it. Like, I don't know, some people do on GitHub or on this platform. But the best thing is to get in touch with well, Dr. David Anderson, who's my colleague in Glasgow and the inventor of Maverick, and he can provide a more comprehensive description of the status of that.
Okay, so on the same note, Professor Francesco, are you aware of you know, latest data sets on these public data sets available for this kind of work, which people could take and, you know, try out different AI algorithms, machine learning or deep learning algorithms on?
I would say there are not so many, or there are not. There is not, like, I don't know, image the image or the speech processing community where if you want to propose an algorithm, you must benchmark it on dataset 1, 2, and 3. I think the radar community is starting to say, okay, we need that, but there is a little bit of inertia in people in sharing their own data, even because understandably it takes a lot of time and effort to generate them. So you want maybe to squeeze out from them much before you make them public. I'm aware, of course, of this one that we have shared in Glasgow. I'll put the link there. There is one, I believe, that's been shared by IMEC in Belgium. Again, in terms of, let's say, human movements. I cannot think of much else at the moment. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. There might be that some researchers have published something and I'm not aware. So I apologize if I forget to mention some. But I would say that there is no data set that, you know, every reviewer will say, sorry, you haven't tested your algorithm on that. Therefore, I cannot accept your paper. At the moment, there's no common accepted one. People starting to think, okay, maybe we should make one, but it's not there yet.
Okay, thank you. So I think there are no further questions. So I would like to, you know, thank on behalf of the IEEE chapter for your time and the interesting talk and sharing, you know, the latest work you've done in this area. And we also hope that we together, you know, we get rid of this pandemic and we are able to meet in person very soon, especially the conference we are planning to hold. So we'd like to invite you also if that materializes at the end of the year. So with that, I'll thank you again and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. Bye.